Out along the rice roads of eastern Arkansas, the farmers know me by sound long before they know my face. And what they call me over the radio is the Mosquito Man. You can call me Wade Sutter. I'm 36, and for 9 seasons I've flown agricultural spray drones over flooded rice for anybody with acreage and my phone number. The first Tuesday of fungicide season, a little after 5 in the morning, something white stood up out of the dead center of a client's south field and began to move like a wet sheet on a line. There was no line, and there was no wind, and I was watching it happen on my tablet, through the drone's camera, from a levee road half a mile away. The water lay flat as window glass across all 40 acres except the middle, where that thing swayed and bent and swayed the other way, loose at every joint a person has and a few we don't. I looked up from the screen, out across the actual field, and it was there too, with my own eyes, small and pale, like a napkin stood upright on brown water. I want to be straight with you about the order things happened in, because the order is the whole story. First I saw it, then I learned the rules, and then I watched, from closer than I ever wanted, what happens to a man who breaks them. My rig that summer was a spray drone the size of a card table, 8 rotors, a tank of fungicide slung under its belly, and a camera on a gimbal so I can see what I'm flying over. Rice in that country grows in shallow, flooded paddies held in by low, winding levees, and in July a fungus comes for the grain heads, so for 6 weeks I fly every field on my list at first light. You know that hour when the water goes the color of a nickel and the frogs all quit at once to listen? That was my office, and up until that Tuesday I would have told you I loved it. I worked off the tailgate with my loader, a kid named Dalton Prout, 23 years old, who mixed chemical, swapped batteries, and narrated his own sandwiches while we waited on the drone. That first morning I said, come look at this. Somebody's standing out in the middle of Renner's South 40. By the time Dalton got to my shoulder, the middle of the screen was rice and nickel water and nothing else, and the thing that had been swaying there was gone without a mark. No splash on the feed, no wake, no bent stalks. 40 acres of standing water without one ring on it, like the field had swallowed and kept its mouth shut. Dalton said scarecrow, and I said scarecrows don't leave, and he shrugged and went back to his buckets, and I finished the field with my eyes more on that screen than my flying deserved. When we hauled to the next job, I mentioned it to the farmer, Renner, an old man with a face like a creased map, and I mentioned it the way you mention weather. He went so long without answering that I thought he hadn't heard, and then he said, to his own boots, that I ought to keep my camera pointed at my own business. He said it flat, the way you tell a hired man which gate sticks, with no heat in it anywhere. Then he gave me the one word, scarecrow, same as Dalton had, and walked off toward his shop, and that was the whole of the conversation. I should mention how I came by that route in the first place, because it matters later. I bought the client list off an old spray plane pilot everybody called Duck, who had flown that ground in an actual airplane for 30 years and was hanging it up. When he handed me the folder, he tapped 2 of the farm names with one finger and said, "These here you'll want to fly by your numbers and not by your eye." He didn't explain, and I didn't ask, and I filed it under retirement talk, and one of the 2 names he'd tapped was Renner. I told myself a story on the drive home that first day, the kind you build out of heat shimmer and a short night's sleep, and for 3 days I halfway got it to hold. Then I flew the second name off Duck's finger, a wide old 40 everybody called the Yancey Ground, 9 miles from Renner's place, on a morning so still I could hear my truck ticking behind me. The white thing was standing in the middle of the Yancey water before my drone had even crossed the levee, as if the field and the thing in it came as a set. Same white, same boneless lean, same slow bend and recover, like something practicing how a body moves off a diagram it didn't quite trust. 9 miles apart, and the middle both times, not near a pump or a levee gate, but the geometric middle, as if somebody had folded the map twice and pushed a pin through the crease. I never saw a face on it, and I want to be exact here. It was white the way a grub is white, and it was the shape of a person the way a glove is the shape of a hand, and it never once held still. I flew my lines and sprayed my acres and kept the camera angled away from it, and I noticed that my hands had made that choice a full beat before I had. After that, I started paying attention to what the locals did with their eyes, and it took me a while, because what they did was nothing, and nothing is a hard thing to see. Renner walked his levees watching his levees. The co-op driver backed his rig watching his mirrors. The bin crews kept their faces to the metal, morning and evening, coming and going. Nobody in that county looked at the middle of a field, ever, the way a roofer never looks straight at the sun and no longer has to remind himself not to. One evening, a client's wife brought us iced tea while we finished a load, and Dalton, being Dalton, asked her straight out about the white scarecrow that moves. She smiled, set the pitcher on the tailgate, and called her kids in off the yard, all in one motion, like those were a single chore, and she never answered him at all. The kids went inside without one word of argument, and if you've been around kids, you know that quiet is a siren all by itself. The next thing I did was the wrong thing, and I managed to do it in the most public room in the county. The co-op has a counter with coffee where farmers stand around at 6 in the morning arguing about water and money. And one morning I stood at that counter and asked the whole room. I described it, the white of it, the wrong jointed lean of it, the middles of the fields, and I asked what it was and who put it there and why nobody cared to discuss it. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way a sink drains, one conversation at a time, until it was down to the radio and one man stirring a cup he'd already stirred. The manager found something urgent to study on his clipboard, and the 2 men nearest me paid up and left with their sausage biscuits still in the bag. From back by the seed bags, somebody said scarecrow, and somebody else laughed once, and there was no fun anywhere in that laugh. I drove to my first field feeling like a man who'd asked about rope in a hanged man's house, without being able to name the rule I'd broken. That afternoon, there was an old man leaning on my truck in the co-op, lot like he'd grown up out of the gravel, and he introduced himself as Hollies, no last name offered. A cap faded past any color, forearms like fence posts, and he opened with a question of his own, which was how long I'd been flying rice. I said 9 seasons across 3 states, first season on this ground, and he nodded like I'd answered some other question he'd asked somewhere else, years ago. Then he gave me the rules. In the tone a man out here saves for the power takeoff and the grain auger, which is the tone for the things that will actually take your arm. You'll see it, he said. There's no help for seeing it. Every soul that works this ground sees it, and seeing it is free. But you don't watch it. You let your eyes land and slide off like it's the sun. You give it the corner of your eye and never the middle. And you don't go asking after it. Not at that counter, not at church, not at my graveside. Asking is just watching with your mouth. The last one he saved, until his hand was already on my tailgate, ready to push off and be done with me. Don't you ever pull it closer, son. No binoculars, no rifle glass, no camera trick. Nothing that brings it 1 inch nearer than it already stands. The distance is the mercy. I asked him what it was, which broke his second rule inside a minute of my learning it, and he looked at me the way you look at a dog that's taken up chewing wasps. He said the nearest anybody ever came to knowing was a man named Verlin Amos, and that the knowing was the whole of what went wrong with Verlin. This was back in the 60s by Hollies' count, when the spraying was done out of a yellow biplane, and levees got cut by mule sense and eyeball. Verlin Amos farmed rice north of the bayou, a deacon, a duck hunter, a man Holly's described as level as a poured floor. And Verlin got tired, is how Holly's put it. Tired of a white something standing in his water that the whole county had agreed, without ever holding a meeting, not to see. He watched it for a summer, which was his first mistake, and he asked about it at the gin, which was his second. And then in September, he did the thing you don't do. He set up on his own levee with the spotting scope he used for scoring rifle targets, and he found the white thing in the glass, and he turned the little wheel until it filled the eye. Holly's was 11 that year, and he told me his daddy pried the scope out of Verlin's hands afterward and dropped it in the bayou, brass and all, and no man ever dove for it. Nobody got out of Verlin what the glass had shown him. Holly's said his mouth would set up to speak of it, and then his whole face would close, like a store after hours. What Verlin did with the rest of his life is the part every soul in the county agreed on, because every soul saw it, for decades, whether they cared to or not. He carried a kitchen chair out to the edge of his south field, set it in the grass facing the middle, and sat down, and in every way that counts, he never stood back up. He sat through harvests, through his wife leaving, through 2 floods. His people would walk him inside at dark, and by the time the dew burned off, he'd be back in the chair. He didn't rave, and he didn't wander. He watched the middle of that field with his hands folded, patient as a man in a depot who knows his train is running late but coming. 41 years, Holly's said. He died in the chair on an October morning, and the field he faced had been out of rice and bone dry for a decade by then. I asked what they did with the chair, and Holly's gave me the only smile of the whole conversation, and there was nothing in that smile I wanted any part of. Chair's still out there, he said. You don't move it. Moving it is a way of asking. I drove home from that lot meaning to be a careful man, and mostly, from that day to this one, I have been. The mistake I made was repeating all of it to Dalton the next morning over the tailgate, rules and scope and chair, because he was my crew and I figured he'd earned the warning. Dalton heard me out the way 23 hears anything, with the face on and the doors shut, nodding in the pauses. He said, no disrespect to Holly's, but this was what people did for entertainment before the internet, and every county he'd ever lived in kept some flavor of chair story. And a story about not looking at a thing, he said, is free to tell forever, because there is no way to ever catch it being wrong. He looked for it online that night, too, every spelling of every word we had for it, and found nothing, and the nothing offended him worse than any warning could have. I told him the rules were company policy anyway, and he saluted me with a drone battery in his hand, and for about 2 weeks he even minded them. Here is a thing I worked out on my own that summer and told nobody. It stands in water. It never showed in a drained field, or a bean field, or a pasture. Flooded rice only, and only in the weeks when the water stood deep enough to hold the sky. In October, when the fields drain down for harvest, it isn't anywhere, and the whole county exhales a little without ever admitting it was holding its breath. All winter the ground lies brown and cracked and honest, and a man could walk every acre of it and find nothing under his boots but stubble and duck feathers. Then in May the wells start, and the water walks up the levees an inch a day, and the frogs come back, and some morning in June it is simply there again, the way mold is there. That summer it was there more mornings than not, or else we just crossed its path oftener. From inside a truck cab, those 2 things feel identical, and neither one sits well. We found it standing in fields we'd sprayed the day before, in yesterday's clean water, and I got to where I could feel the middle of a field on my skin before the camera ever crossed it. Herons quit lighting on those fields. A heron will stand all morning in any water in that county, but on the fields where it stood, the birds kept to the far levees and left the middle alone. The frogs were the other tell. Frogs quit by sections, near first, far after, like lights going off down a hallway toward you, and I got to where I could read distance off the silence. I learned to fly my grid with the camera pitched down and my eyes living at the edges of the screen, the levees, the numbers, the battery bar, anywhere but center. You can do good work that way. A surprising amount of this job, it turns out, was never in the middle of the screen to begin with. Twice in July, I caught the gimbal drifting, the camera easing itself back towards center a degree at a time, like a compass needle hunting north, and both times I stopped it with my thumb. I wrote it up as a calibration fault, and the service bench in Memphis found nothing wrong, and the tech asked if I'd been flying near strong magnets, and I told him no, just rice. And one afternoon at the airstrip, I finally understood a thing I had been looking at for years. Duck's old yellow spray plane, parked in its hangar, had the left cockpit glass painted over white. What I didn't know through any of this was what Dalton was doing with his nights. The drone writes its video to a card, hours of it, sharp as a church window, and part of Dalton's job was pulling the cards, backing up the flights, and wiping them for the next day. Which means every white thing my camera ever crossed was sitting on a hard drive in his mama's house, patient as money, waiting on a bored kid at 1 a.m. He told me later, in one of the last talks we had where he was all the way home behind his own eyes, how it started. He was going to settle it, he said. Freeze one clean frame, blow it up, prove it was a feed sack on a post or a trick of light on water, and win the argument with Hollies once and for all. The first night, he said, the zoom gave him nothing but smear, and he was nearly satisfied, and the nearly is what carried him back the second night. The second night, he stacked frames and sharpened, the way kids know how to do now, and he got it up to the size of the whole screen, and he sat with it a long time. He never told me what the screen showed him, and I never asked him, and I would count both of those among the few smart moves I have made in this life. What I saw from the outside came on smaller and slower, and I have been over it enough times since to know the stages by heart. Stage 1, he went quiet, which in a kid who used to narrate his own sandwiches was loud as a fire bell. Stage 2, he started standing wrong. I'd glance over from the controls and find him faced out at the field instead of in at the truck. Hands hung, weight even, like a man in line at a window. Stage 3 was his eyes, and stage 3 is the one I would pay real money to forget. A person's eyes snag on things, tailgate, wrench, your face, the screen. His had quit snagging. His gaze had gone smooth, like a bead of water finding the low middle of everything it touched. He'd settle on the center of the shop floor, the center of the lot, the center of the windshield with the road pouring under it. And when I said his name, he came back with a lag, like satellite TV. He took to wearing sunglasses on the drive, even in the gray before sunup, and I let myself call that a hangover, because the other answer was that he was rationing his eyes. And his blinking had gone widely spaced and regular, like something on a timer, which is a small thing to notice about a man and an enormous thing to sit next to at 50 miles an hour. His girls stopped coming around in August, and I don't blame her, and I don't think he noticed, and the not noticing was the loudest part of the whole slide. I lifted the hard drive out of his backpack one evening while he coiled hose, in plain view, moving slow, giving him every chance in the world to stop me. He watched me do it, and all he said was that it didn't matter now, and he said it kindly, the way you'd tell a man the store he was driving to had closed an hour back. I drove that drive to the middle of the bayou bridge the same night, and what I did to it with a hand sledge voided every warranty it ever had, and I watched the pieces go down. 2 days later, I found him at a field edge at first light, before I'd even unloaded, standing in the levee grass in his socks, faced in at the middle, boots left in the truck like an apology. The second time was a field on the far side of the county, one I hadn't sprayed yet, and hadn't named to a living soul, and his truck was idling on the levee with the driver's door hung open. I walked him back both times and put coffee in him and called it low blood sugar out loud, and neither of us reported to the other what we both knew. I started varying my route after that, pulling fields in orders that made no sense on paper, and never once saying the days list out loud in front of him. It didn't matter. Wherever I set up, if he could get there, he got there, and how he knew I never worked out. I tried every ordinary answer on, and not one of them buttons. The first Saturday of August, his mama called me at 4 in the morning, and the phone had that tone a house line gets when the bad news is already standing in the room with the caller. Dalton wasn't in his bed. His truck sat in the yard, and the back door stood open onto the dark, and the porch bulb that had worked the evening before was burned out black. I drove the levee roads with my window down, and the frogs were sawing away everywhere, and I remember being glad of the noise, because by then I knew what the frogs going quiet was worth. 2 miles out from his mama's place, the frogs stopped, all at once, like a cord pulled out of a wall, and I took the next levee too fast for the gravel. My headlights swept the field and found him on the first pass, 40 rows out in the flooded rice, standing in water to his thighs with his back to me. The water around his legs lay dead flat, not one ring on it, though he would have had to wade every step of the way out there in the dark. And past him, out where his face was pointed, there was a white place on the darkness that my eyes kept sliding off of, the way one magnet turns another away. It was moving. Even at that distance, in that no light, I could tell it was moving, and that it was moving faster than daylight had ever shown it to me. I did not look at it. I set my eyes on the back of Dalton's neck like a man setting a fence post, and I leaned on the horn, and the horn sounded like a toy in a gymnasium. He turned his head halfway, enough to show me the line of his cheek, and he stood there between me and it, and I understood he was choosing, and that I was one of the 2 things on the ballot. I got out and stood on the levee and called his name once, and then I told him his mama was up cooking, and I had sausage biscuits in the truck, which was a lie I remain proud of. Something in the smallness of that reached him. Breakfast belongs to the world where eyes still snag, and he took one slow step backward through the water, and then another. He waded out of that field backward the whole way, never turning around, thighs pushing water, and I kept my own eyes nailed to his shoulders and nowhere past them. When his boots came up onto the levee gravel, the frogs started again, all of them at once, like a tape unpaused, and I had him in the truck with the door shut before my next breath. He smelled of pond water and battery acid, and he said one thing on that drive, quiet, with his face against the glass. He said the middle isn't in the field, and then he slept like a child. His mama took him to Little Rock, and the doctors ran every scan a boy can hold still for, and the scans came back clean as a new tablecloth. One doctor, a young one, asked him what he looked at all day, and Dalton said the middle, polite as a spelling bee, and the doctor wrote it down, and the pen sounded loud in that little room. They gave it a name with the word acute in it and pills that made him sleepy, and sleep was the one place he still went all the way to, so nobody fought the pills. He stopped coming to work, and I want to be plain that I stopped bringing him. A man cannot run a crew and a search party out of the same truck. Even so, twice more that month I set up on a field I had told no one about, and inside the hour his mama's headlights would come down the levee behind me, following him, following something. By September he had gone easy to manage, which was worse than the wandering, in ways I could not have explained to anybody who hadn't stood on that levee in the dark. He sat where he was put, ate what was handed to him, answered what he was asked in a voice like a radio at low volume, and his eyes stayed smooth and level and pointed at the middles of things. His mama could not stand the sight of a kitchen chair by then, and I never asked what she had grown up hearing, or how much of the Verlin business she had watched with her own eyes. So it's a lawn recliner from the farm store, a good one, and it sits at the end of her mowed yard, right where the grass gives up to somebody else's rice. She turns it to face the county road every night after he's inside. I've watched her do it, a small, strong woman turning a chair in the dark, like somebody winding a clock. And every morning, when the dew is still on everything, that chair is faced back around at the field, and the grass under its feet is dry. Now the part where I nearly followed him, because leaving that out would make me a liar of a worse kind, the kind whose story gets other people to try things. End of August, last fungicide pass of the year, fog lying on the water in ropes, and the day's last field sat off by itself between the bayou and a gravel pit, a long way from any porch light. The flight ran clean for 6 passes, and on the 7th, the white thing was in the field with my drone, and this time it was not in the middle. It stood directly under my flight line, dead on the heading the software had drawn, planted in my path, the way a word stands in a sentence you are already reading whether you'd like to or not. The camera found it because a camera looks forward, and my eyes found the screen because that is where a pilot's eyes live. And for one whole second, the 3 of us were in a line. 1 second. I have timed worse things since. A second was enough to know it was nearer than the lens said, and that the sway of it was not sway at all, but something more like counting. I hauled my eyes off at the way you haul a boot out of deep mud, and I put them on the battery bar, and the battery bar was fine, and I hated it for being fine, because I wanted the excuse to land. Then the gimbal began to drift, with my thumb hard against the wheel and the wheel doing nothing, the camera easing itself back towards center, 1 patient degree at a time. I did the single smartest thing I did all summer. I turned the screen brightness down to black and flew home off the map view, gray lines and a small blue arrow, my drone a rumor in the fog. It came in over the levee and set itself down in the wet grass like nothing had happened, tank empty, motors ticking as they cooled, and I boxed it up, keeping the truck between my body and that field. I never once raised my eyes past the truck bed, and still the back of my neck knew exactly where the middle of that 40 was, the whole time, the way your tongue knows a cracked tooth. The card from that flight held 1 file, and the file ran the right length in minutes and the wrong size in every other way, too big, as if something had been added into it. I did not play that file, and I want that part on the record. I carried the card out to the bayou bridge with fencing pliers in my jacket pocket, and I did to it what Holly's daddy did to Verlin's scope, and I stood there until the water settled. When I told Holly's about it at the co-op, in as few words as the thing could be told in, he stirred his coffee once and said that was the first smart thing done on this ground since his daddy's day. Here is what the job looks like now, going into my 10th season, and none of it is written in any manual that came in the box with the drone. There's a strip of blue painter's tape across the center of my tablet, 2 inches wide, worn soft at the edges, and my flight lines and my eyes both live outside of it. I fly with the camera pitched down at the crop and never level at the horizon, and I told the service bench to quit clearing the gimbal drift alarm, because I want to hear it every single time. When new ground comes my way, I ask the farmer 1 question, whether there's any part of the property he'd sooner I didn't film, and the ones who understand the question hire me twice. Renner still waves from his levee, and the co-op counter went back to selling me coffee like nothing, and the county closed over my summer the way water closes over a ring, outward and complete. Holly's died the next spring in his bed, with his face turned to the wall, and I know that because his granddaughter told me, and she told it like it mattered, and I believe her that it did. At the funeral, nobody said the word scarecrow, and nobody said much of anything else, and the shades on the field side of that church were drawn at 11 o'clock in the morning. I take Dalton breakfast some Saturdays still, sausage biscuits, real ones now, and I sit in the grass a little behind his chair, where the angle keeps my eyes honest. He doesn't say much, and never about that summer, except once, this past October, when the field he faces had been drained down for harvest, and the combines were running dust into the light. He said the middle isn't a spot in the field. He said the field just holds it, the way a clock holds noon. And then he asked, was there another biscuit? And there was, and that was all of it. I still fly, and that surprises people, but a man has a root, and rice doesn't care. And the fungus comes in July whether anybody is feeling brave that year or not. Someday I'll hand my client list to whoever comes after me, and I'll tap 2 farm names with 1 finger, and then I'll break Holly's second rule one last time on purpose, and say the rules out loud. You'll see it, and seeing it is free. Let your eyes land and slide off. Don't ask after it with your mouth or your search bar, and never, with glass or wheel or software, pull it 1 inch closer. The distance is the mercy. Most mornings now the fields are only fields, nickel water and green rose and the frogs sawing away, and my screen shows me nothing but 40 acres of honest work. But some mornings the frogs thin out, and a whiteness rides in past the edge of the tape on my screen. And on those mornings I fly my lines a little wide of center, and the rice comes in fine anyway. It has never minded the margin I leave it. I believe the margin is the point. I believe it has all the middle it needs.